what was the other nice thing about The Art of Computer Programming is it was just fun. Again, the book was a pleasure to read. Knuth put a lot of effort in trying to write, and he writes very, very well and is enjoyable to read. He also has a sense of humour. So there are various interests. So circular definition, that's put there again without any explanation anywhere else as a good example. Circular definition, see definition circular, and you have a very good example of a circular definition. Another example, apparently, there's an item in one of the indexes, I didn't actually check this, but it was reported, use of royalties, or something like royalties, comma, use of, and a page number which had a particular picture of a pipe organ at some stage of where he did. Again, a lot of little playful jokes. It's quite interesting, Knuth commented in his tribute to Floyd when he died that he'd got extensive feedback on The Art of Computer Programming from Floyd, and Floyd had recommended taking out all of the humorous and light stuff. You want to be more serious and definitional, but fortunately Knuth didn't listen and kept the light touch, which is really a pleasure and sets a high standard for how people develop. Another key part of its success and interest was the problems. There was kind of an interesting set, so it went all the way. Someone pointed out proving Fermat's last theorem was one of the challenging problems which hadn't been done at that time. Graded a whole range of set of problems, but they really were challenging, and there are several anecdotal stories that people go to job interviews and say, how would you go about solving one of Knuth's problems? Or the advice, if you really want to learn computer science, go and study this book and solve some of the problems. And that certainly set a good precedent. And another very nice feature is the notion of public good. So, see if I'll find the quote. Yeah, so again, in the introduction to Volume 3, he comments, I decry the current tendency to seek patents on algorithms. There are better ways to earn a living than to prevent other people from making use of one's contributions to computer science. So in general, he wasn't interested in commercialization. In that view, it was a very open, public-spirited way of trying to contribute the knowledge of how best to do things in computing. And the other thing which Knuth started, which is very well known, is his policy on errors. So he decided, again, he wanted to get feedback, and the best way of getting feedback, of course, was to pay for it. So he offered, again, an amount for every error that was found. Quickly, the amount settled on $2.56, so it had to be a power of 2 for his kind of sense of what he did. And anyone who sent him an error got a cheque for $2.56. And the interesting thing, so when I was preparing this talk, I actually discovered one of his cheques. This is from a colleague in Canberra, Henry Gardner. So the cheque's actually made out to Brendan McKay, but I don't think it's readable. But this is one of the cheques for an error. So I've actually seen one of what people actually needed to develop for the various sets of errors. The thing which Knuth found, interestingly, is that most people don't actually cache them. They've got more value as an artefact or a keepsake. I think he described over a period only 7 out of 300 were actually cached at some stage. So, and there's this nice industry of people that can boast they've got a Knuth check, and he's kept it up with all of his books and feedback for doing it. Unfortunately, he actually had to come to a conclusion. He no longer writes personal checks, so this is again on the American California Bank. Apparently, it's too easy to forge checks, and people didn't actually really want to cash them. So as of the last several years, he's created the fictional Bank of Sans Serif, again after the font, and again located in some mythical island somewhere or whatever else. And you now get a $2.56 check for the Bank of Sans Serif for every error that you develop. And Knuth, to his credit, still on his website are the people that he doesn't know how to contact them. So he had a break when he wasn't reading email or processing. I think he took 15 years off, and then went back and said, was that actually the first time an error was found? And for everyone he did, he made his best efforts trying to contact everyone that had found a mistake to actually appropriately behave it. So really quite amazing and a great story and a good precedent and very Knuth-like. Here's the current table of contents of the 7 volumes. I'm not sure that's readable. If you want to find out about it, he's progressing all of the way. He may finish volume 4 soon. I'd be amazed if he finishes all 7 chapters, but the contribution in the versions that you have is truly outstanding. And I'll say a little bit more about it shortly. Okay, so Art of Computer Programming. If that wasn't enough, Knuth is perhaps even better known on a broader circle for his contributions for TeX, which is the computer typesetting program. So why did it come about? Again, in case you hadn't realised, Knuth is an absolute perfectionist, and when he got the galley proofs back from the 2nd edition of the Art of Computer Programming, he was very unhappy. I think some of the fonts, the publishers were moving away from the printing to do more computer typesetting at that stage, and the quality of the font that they'd used actually had gone away. And he said, this is terrible, they don't represent mathematics properly, so this is just not good enough. So what do? Well, I'll write my own computer typesetting program. What do they do when you're computer typesetting? Well, they're just specifying to a machine where you should put black dots of ink. And that's just programming. I'm pretty good at programming. I kind of know how to put, blocks to tell a machine how to do what, so I'll take it on as a task. And so he did, and started initial design of TeX in 1977 and completed a first version in 1978, so over several months. He wrote it in a now defunct language called SAIL, which was the Stanford Artificial Intelligence language, which was a high-level language for developing it. Fortunately, someone was around to rewrite in Pascal a few years later, and it became TeX 82 in 1982, and that's certainly been around, and I've certainly, probably several of you have at some stage programmed in TeX 82 appropriately. The other interesting thing to realise, this whole project was really a precursor of open source. Again, it was done for the whole community to use, and he wasn't doing it for commercial gain, but to make sure that people protected the intellectual property appropriately. So TeX was a masterstroke, and it really did create much better typesetting. And it led to a whole spin-off. So the derivatives, and I'll mention briefly 3 of them. So LaTeX, literate program, Metafont. So LaTeX is a level above TeX. It's a whole set of macro operators. So I have to say I've been involved in projects where people use TeX. I've used LaTeX quite a bit, and it's standard for what we teach computing students. Here, for those of you that went to Terry Towell's talk on the mathematics of the internet last Monday night, LaTeX was the lingua franca of how mathematicians communicate mathematics on the internet. It's just taken an absolute standard to be built on top of it. And I found this diagram, which is probably a good characterization of why LaTeX is a useful tool. And it's how the effort that it takes you to do things in various document processing systems, and comparing LaTeX and Word. So if you've got a very simple document, Word is actually faster and requires less effort. But very quickly, if you start having books or PhD theses, Word becomes very difficult, and beyond a certain size, there are things you just can't do with it. LaTeX, on the other hand, just can scale, and that was the computer science sensibility that Knuth helped bring to the task, and again, has become, that alone has been an enduring contribution. Literate programming was a good idea that Knuth had, and again, when he realised he cared about the look of books, so he said, well, we should actually care about the look of programs. How can I make programs look as nice as books? maybe the standard of documentation for programs should be the same, and thought of having a system where you produce the same quality documents, both explaining what the program did and what the code was. And you have a single document from which you can generate both the description of the program and the program itself. It's a beautifully elegant idea. Unfortunately, it hasn't carried off very far, but would it be that everyone took the level of writing and care for describing the programs that Knuth did, it would be a much better world. But unfortunately, I think it's a bit idealistic and most people didn't develop it. And to some extent, that's true for his third idea, Metafont. And that was the ability, you could define your own fonts, or you could actually be artistically clever in how you build things. So as he was describing tech, he got into and spoke to good calligraphers because he cared about how calligraphy made things look good, and he had a lot of relationships with appropriate calligraphers and designed how could they actually develop their own trade to be able to do calligraphy in a more automated way. And again, a lovely idea. It's crafted beautifully, but just too complicated. And there's a quote, asking an artist to become enough of a mathematician to understand how to write a font with 60 parameters was just too much. So a nice idea, and you can write beautiful fonts, but again, it was just a bit too complicated for the artist, and again, it hasn't really taken off. But again, a lovely idea, and if you are that way inclined, it's great to look at. Okay, and in the words of Monty Python, and now for something completely different. Here's a Knuth book on 316. And what this was sparked by a Bible study group. And as I indicated in the abstract, and probably alluded to, Knuth grew up in a Lutheran household and has remained a devout Lutheran, and apparently is part of a regular Bible study group in his church. When it came his turn to lead the Bible study session, he said, and again, what can I do that will be different? So Knuth says, I'll be at least imaginative. He's certainly a creative sort. If I was a computer scientist and I was reading a text, what would I do to verify it or validate it? I wouldn't just read it straight down. Let's do sampling. So let's take a section across the whole text or the corpus of work, and the Bible's not such a big text by large programming standards, so I'll take a little sample. And he chose to say, what would an analysis look like if I took one verse from every chapter of from every book of the Bible? So I think there are about 50 or 60 odd books of the Bible. So I'm going to look at one verse from every book. And he chose chapter 3, verse 16. And he knew there was one for John, apparently. Chapter 3:16 is the announcement of the birth of Christ, so he knew he'd have one good verse, but he went to go and describe it. So having come up with this idea, he said, well, if I'm going to do something nice, I might as well make it artistic. And because of all his relation with calligraphers, he said, would you like to decorate chapter 3, verse 16 in an appropriate way? And because of the connections and networks, he said, yeah, that's a good idea. So we have this book, which is really quite a novel and interesting book, which is analysis, Knuth's explanation of chapter 3, verse 16 of every book in the Bible, together with animated calligraphy of the particular chapter. It was published in 1990. People outside said it's not so available in Australia, which is a shame because it's quite an interesting book. But it actually shows you, so I've enjoyed, and it's interesting, but it actually isn't great biblical study. So maybe the conclusion is stratified sampling isn't a particularly good way to analyse the Bible, or some other level of maybe it was a good exercise, but getting to real insight of how the Bible looks like, it actually didn't get there. So it's interesting, but not actually insightful. Now, for me, that's actually a virtue, because I think people should be encouraged to do all kinds of activities. So just because you're not expert shouldn't mean you shouldn't do anything. So I actually take it as an inspiration. You can actually do interesting things without having to be particularly expert. Here's one of the chapters. I did actually scan it. So this is one of the versions. This is chapter 3, verse 16 of Deuteronomy, which is someone chose to do it of a map of Israel. That's the Dead Sea and the Jordan River with a geographic explanation. Some of the other ones are quite different. If anyone interested, I can show you several other examples later on, but for now I will leave it. But it did spin off another project, which again is a Knuth-like project. Knuth got invited later in the 90s to give a series of 6 lectures, I think from the theology department, on the relationship between religion and science. So which isn't something which you look at, and indeed most computer scientists aren't devout religious followers. So it's kind of interesting explaining how you would actually describe the relationship. That book actually is on sale outside. Oh, there's a copy of the book there. And again, interesting. A lot of it is a lot of the reaction that he got to the book 316. So Knuth personally got a lot of positive feedback from doing his Bible study book. But again, I'll leave you, if you're interested in what Knuth says about computing, I certainly am happy to recommend it. It's probably in the same category as the Bible study, interesting but no deep truths or particularly novel insight. But it's someone who is honestly able to reconcile both his scientific beliefs and his religious beliefs, and they happily coexist for him. The range of other projects, and again, I'm now on my last one before I go to the kind of set. Here, Surreal Numbers was something which Knuth did when he was on sabbatical in Norway in 1972. He had taken an idea of Conway, which defined numbers algorithmically, and I'll read to Knuth. So I wrote it's a novel explaining a mathematical construction. I wrote it for fun, hoping that it will transmit some pleasure to readers, but also with a serious purpose, namely to provide some material which would help to overcome one of the most serious shortcomings in our present educational system, the lack of training for research work. There is comparatively little opportunity for students to experience how new mathematics is invented until they reach graduate school. I decided that creativity can't be taught using a textbook, but that an anti-text such as this novel might be useful. So again, it's an attempt to try and make mathematics fun and interesting and definitional. And again, he polished it off in a couple of weeks, and again, it was a lovely exercise to be able to do it. Another book, there's been a problem for those of us that have tried to teach the appropriate mathematics for computer scientists. It's often taught in engineering schools that teach continuous maths and calculus, which isn't the way that you need to think for a lot of computer science. So Knuth wrote a book, Concrete Mathematics, which has got a lot of fun edge notes and got his own sense of style and humour around. And I think he had some fun with concrete mathematics not being appropriate for civil engineers, or had various concrete-related puns related at various stages. But again, a charming book, and again, something which he's able to look at. He's got various collections on his academic papers, and one which is a book that perhaps isn't well known, the Stanford Graph Base, which is an example of literate programming. So what he actually decided to do, and this is in preparation for the 4th volume of The Art of Computer Programming, was to say, I want some data which is relevant for how people discover things, and if I'm going to have the appropriate programs to measure, I'll have my own convictions. So he used literate programming to have both the text and the words, and he's got some interesting programs. And he's got some standard data sets that are available for people to do measurement, and I'll mention just 2 of them. So one of the data sets that he has are the 5,757 five-letter words in English that there are around that he's discovered over his years. So he probably kept his records from solving Ziegler's giant bar or whenever in 8th grade. But doing things like word letters, how's the best way to see if there's a path from one five-letter word to another five-letter word so you can actually run it out. And another data set that he's got are the last 128 cities from the Rand McNally US Guide, and use that as a place for distances between cities, for doing graph algorithms and search and various spanning trees for real data, and having all of that accessible. And 128 cities is probably good for analysing a range of different graph theory algorithms, again, available to the public to really try and get honest comparison and basis. And he's using those examples in volume 4 of the Art of Computer Programming. I was going to say something about the errors of tech, but I'll leave that for time. So the last thing I want to talk about is why I admire him and have some comments. I guess part of that has been come out so far, but I'll say a little more about each of them. The first one is his essential humility. Again, he's very unprepossessing man. I mentioned I met him in 1990 when he came to give the gold medal lecture at Case. Of all of the academics I've visited, he's been far the humblest and the one who's most been prepared to engage with students. He generally took time and had interest talking to the students where he was. He sat on the floor to discuss them. He answered any questions that they had, making them feel valued for every particular question, and in general was the nicest engagement and not a prima donna in any way, shape or form in his activity. Really a truly humble person. Second thing, which I think is great, is his sense of humour, that he's been able to carry on for his books. I said anyone that can write units for Mad Magazine has my respect immediately, and he's been able to keep it up, and which I enjoy, which is great. His mathematical taste has been very good. The degree of elegance that he looks to provide in various areas are fine, and if there's any sense of elegance in the books that I've been available to, Knuth's style has definitely been an inspiration to try and aspire to get some degree of elegance and a lighter area. The next point is probably, I've said diplomatically, that he, as a speaker, he is sincere rather than an orator, and actually that's code for he's actually not a very good lecturer, if you go and develop it. And I actually personally found that quite comforting, because again, lecturing isn't particularly my forte, and knowing that there's a very famous figure who isn't a very good lecturer either was actually a comfort at various stages. He keeps going though, and again, in his computer musings, he does make himself available. He'll talk about a range of topics, and whenever he goes, he will engage. He's always very pleasant in those kind of conversations. So what he makes up for lack of oratory, he comes across with sincerity in the way that he develops it. Another one, which is amusing, is he's a poor time estimator. And again, that's something which I'm often not good at, and I'm probably not as extreme as Knuth, so he can go on diversions for his book. So Tech was a 10-year diversion away from the art of computer programming. He thought, I'd just do a small thing, but I just want to get this right. And 10 years later, he finished the appropriate computer typesetting and got back to his various areas. So again, it's something, it really in some ways is a nice feature that he did use his own judgment of what he thought would be done. And really the last point is his sense of integrity and doing what he thought was the right thing is also extremely impressive in a whole range of different areas. He'll use his own standards to decide what's interesting, so the Stanford graph base of what are good data sets are good, the concrete mathematics, what should mathematics be taught, and his consistency with handing out error checks. He's really very, very good at keeping his word, making his decisions, and using his own judgment of what he was able to develop. And really an inspiration for all of us. And I'm not sure how many A-plus journal publications he ended up with, or what his citation count is, or for whatever else. But by God, he definitely had a huge impact in all computing. And really, the future of academia really should be to encourage more people like Knuth that do creative, fun activities in their endeavours.